Welcome to Masters of the Air Talks. This is a great show today. John and I are welcoming a special guest, Franz Gayl. Now, here's the thing. I had a great opportunity come along when I first met John Peace, who's my co-host of this show. He was publishing a book about his grandfather, Captain Jimmy Galloway, who was a B-17 bomber pilot in World War II. At the exact same time I was working on John's book, I was introduced to Franz Gayl, who was publishing a book about his father, who was a paratrooper for Nazi Germany. And I was able to publish their books at the same time and share the manuscripts of each other so that they've actually read each other's books and provided a testimonial for each other's books. It's on the back cover and on the websites. And this is now an opportunity for these two authors to come together. And we're going to start a series where we will be introduced to the concepts that are in both of the books as far as what was going on in Germany, what was going on in the United States, and compare and contrast those experiences. So excited for this. You're both brilliant men and have phenomenal books, as you both know, because you've read each other's books. So I thought we'd just start the show out with a little bit of talk about just sort of the generalities of what life was like. And then we can get the details of each of your loved ones' backstories.
Who do you want to start out, Mel?
I know. John, why don't you give us a off? Since you're the co-host, I'll put you in charge.
Yeah, I'll just give a little background of and you've heard this story before, a little bit about why I wrote my book, and a little bit of probably the most important reason I found that Franz's book was so fascinating to me was giving a little backstory to some of these men going into World War II. We've had Band of Brothers, we've had Masters of the Air, we've had the Pacific, and, so many, great war stories that have been documented and stuff. But I always thought they left out a little bit of exactly who these men were before the war. And, you kept hearing about how tough these guys were. And, all this, today's generation couldn't do what they went through and stuff. And whether that be true or not, you've got to really kind of know how they grew up to understand how they did make it through World War II and stuff. And I found Franz's book fascinating because it was such a contrast to what I grew up and my family story going through the Great Depression and then ultimately into World War II that, shaped the rest of our lives and stuff.
They were punished hard with reparations that they had to pay other countries who were injured through the war. And it was now called the Weimar Republic, a democracy that replaced the what had been prior to Imperial Germany. After the war, there was Weimar Republic. Anyways, they couldn't pay back the heavy loans, the heavy reparations, and it caused an economic crisis. And so in this Weimar Republic, again, a democracy, suddenly money became worthless in a situation that's basically a hyperinflation. And people in Germany actually starved to death in various locations. Maybe not in the big cities, maybe not in the wealthier areas, but it was a bad time for Germany. And that whole period, in a nutshell, the crisis in the Weimar Republic kind of gave rise, leads into the Great Depression, kind of gave rise to the desire to have strong leadership, even if it was extremist, and that kind of led to Adolf Hitler. So my dad grew up during that period, and it was around 1932, 33. The Nazis were becoming very popular and impactful already in the early 20s, right after my dad was born. And that carried on through the 20s and then into the 1930s, where we saw Hitler become the Führer. He became the singular leader of Germany. And Well, anyways, my dad, growing up in that time, my dad, it was a very idealistic time. First, I will say my dad loved those days. The kids loved the period and the spirit of Germany after the Nazis came to power, and especially based on Hitler's personality, which was sort of a hypnotic personality, but it worked. And so there were many, the young people in Germany absolutely loved the coming of Adolf Hitler. And he had this, he liked to be I guess he was a populist, I guess. He loved to have direct contact with people, and he'd let kids run up to his car and his in the motorcade. And he moved around with the top down, and so he was really, I mean, he was a poster boy for a populist. So my dad was growing up in that very motivating environment, and one of the things he joined early on was called the Hitler Jungvolk. And it's actually the Deutsche Jungvolk, which is the German Jungvolk, but essentially it's inspired, it was something started by Hitler. These were the young kids they were the Cub Scouts, essentially, of Nazi Germany. And so they started at a young age, maybe 8, maybe 10, I can't exactly remember, it's in the book. And they had a blast. And the Jungvolk was not politicized as other organizations were later. The kids they made their own little carts, and they'd march around the countryside. They'd sing patriotic songs. They camped out. People welcomed them. They sort of serenade the towns when they come walking through. It was a very happy time. Now, another thing about the background of my dad. He came from what you would call a bourgeois family in Berlin. His dad was had been a federal judge in the Weimar Republic. His mom was my grandma was a well-known musician. And so they weren't hurting too bad. They were not hurting too bad, even during the crisis of the Weimar Republic, and especially in the heart of Berlin. And they also lived in a very elegant neighborhood called Charlottenburg, and a lot of other, hoity-toity people lived there as well. So it was not a childhood of hardship at all. And so that had a great influence on my dad's enthusiasm, I'm sure, because, he wasn't not struggling with starvation. He was doing well. And so he completely embraced the spirit of the Nazi Party when he came in. And so he went to the Jungvolk. He did that for a few years, a period he just loved to talk about it, when they were just allowed to go without any political constraints. In other words, no one required them to carry any kind of message with them. They weren't indoctrinated in any way, but they all wore uniforms and they marched around. After that, then came at age, again, it's in the book, age 16, 17, maybe 15. My dad joined the Hitler Youth, the Hitler Jugend. And that was a different organization altogether. Now they're all older, these kids, and they're kids growing into young men. And so they're being prepared for service, whether it be military service, whatever they're going to do later in life. But they were preparing to be, even though they weren't yet, they were preparing to be National Socialists. And that is my dad's identification from his Hitler Youth time. And he didn't have as much fun. None of the kids had as much fun with the Hitler Youth days, because they felt they were being constantly supervised by the adults. And they had a clubhouse. He and his friends had a clubhouse, and they would go in there and tell stories about World War I and talk about their dads who fought in World War I. But they were not being politically correct in terms of remembering the right war. So they were asked to change their tune. It wasn't a pleasant thing for those kids. And so now they just had to basically sing the National Socialist story, the stab in the back, all the things that are happening, bringing on the anti-Semitism, the whole spirit of what we're more familiar with Nazi ideology. And yes, the anti-Semitism was a fundamental part of youth education growing up in the Third Reich. And what you see is that there was very famous movies, two movies, Jude Süß, which is a story about back in the 1700s in Swabia, about a Jewish bad guy, and all the Swabians were good guys. The Germans, the non-Jewish Germans, were good guys. It's a long story, but it's a very famous movie, very influential. And then another one came out, Triumph of the Will. That came out a little bit later, where it was one of the best propaganda films ever made, and I think it's still recognized as such, advertising the Nazi cause. So, anyways, that was a period of ideological indoctrination during the 30s.
Wow.
So my dad also, interestingly, he had a friend who also lived in Charlottenburg, lived well, who happened to be the stepson of Joseph Goebbels, because Goebbels also lived in the neighborhood. And so Harold Quandt was my dad's best friend in school. They walked to school every day together, and they were in the same class. And here you see Goebbels marrying Harold's mom, and there's Adolf Hitler standing in the background. They're marching at the wedding or whatever. And this was in the early 30s. And then there are this Hitler with Harold, and there's a picture of Harold later when he was in the military as a paratrooper. And it's always interesting. There's always a backstory. My dad's mom was born Jewish. Okay, so she converted later to Catholicism because she married a Prussian. But that's always an interesting story. But of course, she came from a social environment where, those kind of things were the things we don't talk about. We don't mention their Jewish ancestors. So she was actually received a lot of protection, as many Jews did in Germany, simply because of the connections. My uncle Bruno, my grandpa's brother, was a pretty high-ranking guy in the bureaucracy, the Nazi bureaucracy in Berlin, and he had this status because he joined the Nazi Party very early in the 20s, and so he kind of, when my grandpa was gone, he died later, he protected my grandma and my dad, because my dad is quarter Jewish. Maybe someone call him half Jewish.
It'd be interesting to know how many actually fought for the Nazis that actually had. Well, anyways,
now you got Harold Quandt, and you got my dad. These quarter Jews going to school together and going through the same dynamics and enthusiasm of that period.
Well, Franz, let me stop and ask you something right quick. Given that family background right there, did your dad have any qualms with that anti-Semitism propaganda?
No, he didn't.
As
far as he viewed himself, he knew his grandpa. He knew his grandpa is Mai. That was his name. That's a Jewish name, a well-known Jewish name from that time. And he was wealthy. He was a wealthy banker. Okay. And blah blah blah. And he was a part of his childhood. But religion didn't matter anything. It didn't matter to my dad. And even this whole ideological thing, this was not important to the kids. They were being brought up as patriotic Germans. The ideology stuff, whether it be anti-Semitism or whatever, was secondary.
Or you can understand.
They just wanted to be good soldiers.
Yeah. You can understand from outside looking in, just that whole scenario of having a mother who's part Jew and stuff, and then belonging to an organization that's preaching against, getting rid of them. But also shows the power of the organization, the propaganda, and their age too. And we're talking about kids too.
It also goes to the power of parents and relatives. In other words, those are the things that we're talking about. We don't talk about your mom, the fact that she's part-trooper.
So I want to jump over to John and get his background, because I really want, with the two of your backgrounds established, to hear your thoughts and interaction, because you're both brilliant men. I want to hear your conversation. So let's jump over to John and get some of his backstory from his grandfather, and compare and contrast that with Germany at the same time. So John, you want to kind of...
Yeah, sure. And like I said earlier, that one reason I found Franz's book so fascinating was it was coming from such a different world than my papa's family, which is the Galloway family. His name was Jimmy Galloway. Growing up in a little community called Crackers Neck, which is right outside of Big Stone Gap, Virginia. And give you a little geography, we're right on the Kentucky-Tennessee border, right down there in that little tip. And it's mainly coal mining territory. It's the coal fields of Virginia. We're right on the edge of it. But it's a little farming community. The Galloway family, we immigrated from Wales probably in the mid 1800s via some through Ireland and then into America. And, we're just small subsistence farming. And when my granddad was born in 1920, he grew up, his particular family, because they owned a farm. This is Powell Valley right here, a picture of where our farm is located. My granddad always said that they grew up rich poor. And what he meant was they never worried about food. They always had food. They just didn't have money. And he would always talk about, his first memory of actually having some money was probably a teenager. And they grew up in a very agricultural society where you traded. It was a barter system. Franz, you talked about in Germany's, and he didn't talk about growing up with hyperinflation. He talked about nobody had money. Money just didn't exist in their world. So, when you traded groceries, everything was on the trade. He was talking about even when he got born, his brother, the doctor, got paid with a bushel of corn for delivering his brother. And they used to kid my granddad as being a 2-bushel baby, because by the time he was born, the price had gone up to 2 bushels of corn to pay the doctor to deliver him. And you couldn't imagine a world today where the doctor's payment for baby delivery was 2 bushels of corn. But they had a whole system set up. A week's worth of wages might have been a feeder pig, and they just had a whole system. So they grew up. They didn't grow up hungry poor, but all around them there was extreme poverty. And this is, their primary industry where he grew up was coal mining. This is a picture from the 1920s. Young men as young as 8 to 10 years old would start working to try to provide for their family. And the working conditions, this is pre-union, pre-government, any regulations and stuff. So you could imagine that the working conditions were horrendous. My granddad was talking about, his first job, and he was very fortunate to get a job outside of the coal mines at a pet dairy products. And they manufactured ice cream and of course fluid milk and different cottage cheeses and stuff. And he was talking about how he felt so blessed having that job right there. And that's him in the uniform. But now shifts ran 6 10-hour shifts or 12-hour shifts. So you worked 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day. And then the night shift would work a 12-hour shift. So this is long before any 40-hour standard work week. Talk about his first paycheck. I mean, they made about $40 a month working those type of days. The one day you would get off would be Sunday. And of course, in rural America and rural, even today, church was a very big part of that. And that's a picture of their church they grew up with. And my great-grandfather was a Baptist preacher. And this is him in their Sunday best. Now, one thing, they were very fortunate, even as poor, cash poor as they were, they always had church clothes. And you only wore it to church on Sundays, and then you had school clothes. And then, he talked about most of his memory. He said, you went barefoot except in the wintertime and walking to school and school, church, and work. That was it. That was your three aspects of your life and stuff. So, you know, and, you know, we've talked about on other shows and stuff about, and Franz, I felt it so interesting with your father. You see that patriotism to Germany. I can remember one of my grandfather's fellows, peers of World War II, you know, talking about that's a rich man's fallacy, patriotism. He said the only thing we were worried about growing up was where to find the food that day. And even going to school, they didn't necessarily go to school to learn. They went to school hoping there'd be some food there. And this was before school lunches. This a scene from a high school football game during the same period as my grandfather. And this is actually East on Gap, where he grew up. Such a different world that he grew up. And also, and when talking about when the war started, my grandfather had an older brother who had joined the Navy. Okay. Back then, I mean, Uncle Graham, he joined the Navy just to escape the poverty. He was getting out of these mountains. He wasn't going to be a coal miner, and he wanted a better life for himself. So the services was a way to escape. And so when the war broke out, you know, my grandfather, he talked about, you know, his younger brother was joining, his older brother was already in there. He said, son, I joined the military because my brothers were there. And, you know, I wasn't going to let them go off, fight the war, and I not be part of it. And then also there were so many, you know, people that actually joined during the war just to escape the poverty situation that they were back home. And it's just so hard to imagine that you would join to fight in a war because it might be a better life than what you were experiencing where you were at. And that was the poverty, especially in the Deep South during the 1930s and the Great Depression. So. So when I read Franz's book, and you know that totally different with the Hitler Youth and you know the parades and the uniforms. One reason there was no little baby pictures of my granddad when I was trying to look through. My granddad said, "Well, son, only rich people had a camera. You didn't see a lot of pictures from poor people." And another thing, talk about how anti-political they were. He said, "Can you imagine growing up in a world where you know, only rich people had newspapers, only rich people had a radio." And he said, you know, we were very isolated. The only news we got was people kind of passing through. And he said, and most people didn't really care about what was going on in the rest of the world because they were more cared about where they were going to find some food that day. So it's hard for us to imagine today, the world they grew up in.
Well, I'd love to hear you both talk about the contrasts and the comparisons now that we've got the backstory of each of your loved ones' lives, and some of the things that you learned, because I know that, John, you grew up hearing, actually in your mid-teens, you started hearing your grandfather's stories, which is what led to you writing your book. Although he didn't talk about it before then, we established he was somewhere in his 70s when he finally started.
He would talk about stories growing up, but now the war stories didn't happen until I was in 8th grade. You know, and I write about
when you started hearing the war. Yeah, he was quite a storyteller, but the actual
he loved telling stories, but you would not hear the war stories.
And Franz, when did you hear the stories of war from your father? Or how did you get the stories that you're sharing? I'm gonna go ahead and step off and let you two converse, so I can bring you both on screen a little more, and just feel free to kind of ask each other questions. I know that you've been excited to have this conversation here today. So,
well, John, looking back, I learned most of the stories from my dad directly.
Okay.
Because he loved that period. And, but I also learned many of the stories from my mom.
Yeah.
And so between the two of them, and then there was all sorts of additional evidence with, you know, documentation, all that other stuff. So it was pretty easy to draw a pretty accurate picture of what was going on back then. In terms of actually becoming conscious of the issues, I think I mentioned that I'll tell it's in the book in detail, but it's just a crazy story. My dad was born to a Prussian father and a converted Jewish mother, and the Jewish grandfather had said, "Oh, don't have at birth. We have to make sure that your son is circumcised." Well, that was a big deal. It
Yeah.
still is. And my grandpa, also Franz Gayl, said, there is no way I'm going to let my Prussian son get circumcised. You can forget about it. So after birth, my dad was not circumcised. Well, then several years later, I think I mentioned, he passed away, heart attack. And Uncle Bruno, his brother, kind of looked after my grandma and my dad. And my grandma felt so bad that her father would not see that my dad would be marked as a Jew, that he wasn't circumcised. So she felt so bad about it, and without telling Bruno, who's of course a National Socialist, she went and saw a rabbi. And this is like in the early 30s. Which exact year it is? My dad was 12. Yeah, it would be 33 or 34.
Mm-hmm.
And she took him to a rabbi, and she had to have him circumcised, just to fulfill her past dad's thing. She did not tell my dad what they were going to see the rabbi for. And of course, anti-Semitism is rife at this time.
Yes.
And so when my dad is 12 years old, it hurts just to think about it. And so she took him in to see the rabbi and asked the rabbi to do the circumcision. And my dad was just like recoiled. I mean, like,
bless his heart.
and now he's suddenly dealing with this religious stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so it took a lot of coaxing and not a loyalty to the mom, whatever mom says is the right thing. He was circumcised at age 12 with no anesthesia. It's just awful. And now, what I want to say about that is that what happened to him was butchery. It was sort of it was the same sort of thing that was being taught to them in the schools that was stereotypical Jewish.
Okay.
So all you need to do is have a couple instances where it actually reinforces an exaggerated stereotype. These things start to sit with kids. And it did.
Also, that just pushed them with the propaganda. Preaching the gospel. Yeah.
And then when my dad went off to camp for that summer with his Hitler Young Folk buddies, maybe they were already in his future Hitler Youth buddies, they went up to the North Sea and they went swimming. But my dad wouldn't go in the water.
Yeah.
Why? Because the thing was healing.
Wow.
And you probably go back to the Old Testament. There was, the sons of Israel killed whole tribes when they were healing from circumcision. So you can imagine. So he didn't tell anybody. He didn't tell anybody what was wrong with him. But when Uncle Bruno found out, he was furious because he knew the implications. And it was at that point. Now we're jumping a little bit forward, getting back to the political issue. My dad and Harold Quandt, both wanted to become SS officers, right? I mean, it's that's kids put a dream for. Want to be special ops, want to be an officer, whatever. So they wanted to be SS officers because that was really the elite. And and so the recruiters came into the school and asked, anyone want to volunteer for this or that? And so they all went home enthusiastically to ask their parents. And Uncle Bruno found out this, and he already knew about this crazy circumcision thing. I don't know what my grandma was thinking. And he came over right away and he said, no. You sit down. I got something to share with you. He said, you are now marked as a Jew. You are, you're the poster child Aryan kid, but now you're marked as a Jew. He was so mad at his sister-in-law. And he says, you cannot at all attempt to join the SS. And you can't attempt to become even an officer in the Wehrmacht.
Yeah, and besides being marked, they would probably look a lot more into family history, right?
Yes. Everyone carried what was called Stammbaum. It was a family tree. It was very beautiful. A little document.
Wow. I did not know that. Okay.
In his family history, my dad's family history, you found bankers, Jewish bankers, and you even found rabbis. I forgot how many generations back. Bruno knew this, and Bruno was in the background protecting my dad's mom and my dad. So, but he said, if you go and apply for these very special jobs, they are going to ask for your Stammbaum.
Yeah.
And as soon as they ask for your Stammbaum, your Jewishness, I say Jewishness, is going to be revealed. Okay. So Uncle Bruno shared with my dad, he said, there's no way you were going to go and apply for those positions in the military.
Quick question, Franz. If your dad had been found out, would even Bruno, would he have been in danger?
Bruno might have been in some kind of danger, but he was a through and through Prussian. He was a good Nazi. He was a trusted guy. And there were other people protecting families at that time. This was in the 30s. And so, he probably would have gotten chewed out, but, not that big deal. But my dad's half Jewish or full Jewish, however you want to look at it, mom, she would have easily been deported at that time. Okay. We're talking about the early 30s, and much worse later. And my dad would have lost his citizenship because then they had the citizenship laws in effect. So it was a serious issue. And so instead of being my dad, and he'd already gone through this stupid circumcision thing, he said, that ain't going to stop me. I'm going to find another way. And Uncle Bruno said, okay, you can join as an enlisted man. You can go into the Wehrmacht. No one's going to bother you there. No one's going to look at your wee, or they're not going to look at your papers, right? We only look at officers.
Yeah, they're looking for bodies, right? Yeah.
With Harold Quandt. And one day the recruiters for this new branch came in, and for the paratroopers, Luftwaffe. These are the Goering's guys. And there's a new branch just forming up. And we had similar things going on in other nations. Paratroopers were new to the Soviet Union. Paratroopers were new to the United States. Right? It was just go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, well, one thing, I'll give you an example. This shows you how different my granddad grew up. I write a short chapter about when he picked his Jewish flight crew, his officers, and they couldn't believe he picked them. I mean, the anti-Semitism that was in the United States is well documented. The eugenics movement of the 20s was in high swing and stuff. But like my granddad said, he said, son, I was so isolated and ignorant as far as lack of knowledge. He said, I'd only met 2 Jews in my life by that time, and they were pretty good fellas. He said, I didn't know I was supposed to be prejudiced against. But it kind of shows you how much the politics and the religion of the day affected your dad versus it wasn't affecting my granddad. He said, well, I was ignorant of it.
And I would say at an earlier age, both your granddad and my dad were very much the same because they were uninterested in something like that. It didn't make sense to them.
Yeah.
These were just other kids or other people. There was no politicization of anything.
Yeah.
My dad had to confront it in his teens, but he wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah.
And look at Harold Quandt. His mom's married to Goebbels. I mean, geez, Louise. And that's being covered up. We don't cover.
What happened to Harold? What's his life story?
Well, Harold, very interesting. I can jump ahead a little bit. Stories also in the book. Harold went and joined the paratroopers with my dad. The recruiters came in and said, for any volunteers for the paratroopers, this new branch and this crazy job of jumping out of airplanes, you can, as long as your grades are okay, you can skip your last year of the gymnasium and graduate. So you get it kind of as a gift, right?
Yeah.
So there's my dad and Harold, raising their hands.
Wow. So that was such a contrast in family story, family history than what I grew up with, and the other World War II peers that would come by the farm and stop by and talk to my granddad. you know, and their war experiences afterwards. You know, my granddad, I've talked to Melanie about this before, you know, after the war, I mean, my granddad helped buy the farm that we live on today. You know, the VA benefits was part of that, the VA loan system. I write about Coach Burchell Stallard. He went on to finish up his college through the GI Bill. That's Coach Burchell Stallard there.
Yeah.
You know, and that GI Bill in America was so beneficial to help build this country because, you know, I was telling Melanie, when you do the economic history of it, there were so many World War II veterans that became self-employed after the war. And like my granddad talked about, he said, son, after I went through, he said, it was awful hard to sit in an employee meeting and have a boss complain about production or complain about, you know, what bosses complain about. And I think your dad had the same problem reading your book, that getting back in that everyday life, you know, after that experience, you know, was hard on him. And that was one reason my granddad became self-employed, was to be his own boss. So,
well, the education benefits were the big thing that came out of the GI Bill back then. And that's why we call it the greatest generation. Yes. Educated, hardworking, patriotic.
Yeah.
In the case of, that was the case with my stepdad, but he's not the topic here. In the case of my dad, it was a little different. He returned from being a POW, and he was returned to Berlin, and Berlin was completely, it was destroyed, right? It was a mess. And I think I mentioned before, Albert Speer, in the previous one, that my dad, because of this hoity-toity environment he was in, Albert Speer was Hitler's grand architect. Mm-hmm. And he and Hitler together, mostly with Speer's expertise, they designed, talk about urban planning, they designed a whole new Berlin.
Yeah.
It was going to be a fantastic city with huge, huge buildings and probably later skyscrapers. And my dad, however it happened, he ended up getting a tour when he was a kid. He would have been, again, when he was a teenager. He ended up, because he had an interest and because I think my dad spoke English too. He spoke English, he learned French, English, and German in school. But all these connections and luck, Albert Speer gave my dad a tour of the models of the new Berlin. And so, of course, that just reinforced my dad's interest in becoming an architect later.
Yeah.
And so when my dad went back to Berlin, it's all wrecked. His first interest is, well, I'm going to become part of rebuilding Berlin. And that's an after-war story that we can maybe talk about another time. But it was a little bit different. And in the end, he didn't want to hang around either. He saw a lot of disappointments over in West Germany, divided Germany, and he didn't want to hang around either. But the big thing is that your grandpa and my dad both wanted something greater at that point. Mm-hmm. Your granddad had been victorious in the war, and he wanted something greater after that with the GI Bill. My dad was a defeated enemy in war. Crushing defeat that kill. All the things that happened after the war, the kids who were disenchanted with the Third Reich because they were defeated was horrendous, psychological trauma. So he was looking for something better too.
And that is a perfect segue. I'm really appreciating what you're saying, because both of you have really interesting stories about your loved ones and what they did after the war. And some of the stories are just really heartwarming, and some are quite amazing and even a little funny. So this is really great. I love listening to both of you talk about history in this real personal way as it was experienced. And sometimes the things that happened aren't always known. we get the big history, you know, the universal history. Yeah. But to hear the personal histories that you gain from knowing and listening to someone so close to you that was part of it. And in this case, each of your loved ones were fighting on the opposite sides, but eventually, Franz, your father, did come to America and bring his architect skills here. So grateful to all of you for being here and all those who are watching. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode, which I'm sure we'll have a link to that once that's available. If you enjoyed this, please be sure to like it, because it just helps us to reach more people. If you're not already a subscriber, hope that you'll want to subscribe, because we are having some really good conversations on this channel, just like this, and we have a lot more to come. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Good to see you, Franz.
Good to see you.